All right, so from this lesson, we are going to start dive into the very basic stuff about Flutter development. All right, so to get things started, I want to make sure everyone has your IDE and Flutter development environment totally set up. All right, so basically, you should have either Android Studio, which is I highly recommending, or you should have VS Code to start with your project. In this case, I will just use Android Studio because, in my opinion, it's a more powerful IDE, a lot of cool features, even though it takes more resources, it might be slow, especially if your computer is not very fast. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and start a new Flutter project. So right here, start a new Flutter project. If you don't see this option, that means you don't have a Flutter plugin installed, right? So to install the Flutter plugin, you should go to the configure and then click on the plugins here, and then you can search for Flutter. Okay, and then you want to install this one. All right, so if you already install it, then you don't have to do this again, but that's what you should have with this option here to start a new Flutter project. So let's start this one here, and then it gave you a different template to start with to develop app, plugin, application, package, or module, right? So we'll talk some of those one in the future, but most of the time you're building your application, just choose the first one. And next, you need to choose the project name. And this one is just a kind of a name to describe what you're trying to do here. I'm gonna do a Flutter app demo summer. Okay. All right, and then make sure I locate your SDK. Okay, this is the SDK zip file you downloaded, and then you unzip the file. Right, you have a folder with all the bin folder, every executable there. So make sure you know where this one is located. Okay, very important because sometimes you may lose your configuration. Your project is have some kind of bugs with Android Studio. You always need to go back to reset this path here. So you should make sure where this folder has been saved. And then this is where you save all your project in. So you basically should have some kind of workspace folder. In my case, I created CS4 4990, and then I create a specific folder for this whole summer, and then there's where I'm gonna put this folder in, okay? And then some description you can put here, right? And with that, I'm gonna click on next. So this is the package name, all right? So if you are familiar with Java, and this is kind of a similar idea, that's how you manage your source code. But a lot of applications, including Android, they use this package name to uniquely define and decide if this app is unique or not in all the app stores, right? So when you publish something to Google Play, and they want to look at your packaging name to make sure this is a new app. In other words, you cannot have two packaging names to be the same if you try to publish it, right? So that's why when you're creating your packaging name, make sure this one is always unique. That's why a good convention is to use your company or group's domain name, because domain name you own it, it's very rare that other people will use that. And then you use a specific application name afterwards. So let's say that here we are at university. So right, I'm gonna do edu.cpp. And I'm gonna do more CS4990. And here I would do an example one. All right. So this pretty much guarantees it's kind of very unique. Of course, you cannot prevent people from using the same name, same package. But for development, it's okay. It's just when you start to publish it, you want to make sure this package name is unique. If it's not unique, then you just change it. It's not really a big deal. And then I will actually include all of this by default. It will make your development easier. And then finally, I click on the finish button. And that's going to create a Flutter project. All right, so now we're opening the Android Studio, and then the nice thing about Flutter is it automatically gives you all the files you need, and then creates a sample code for you to run, and we'll talk more about the sample code in the next lesson. And also, if on the left-hand side, all right, so that's where you can see all the project files. Make sure you're on this project tab, because sometimes if you are in a different project, you might choose Android, for example. That's not right, because this is not going to show you the right kind of structure. So make sure you're always on project for the Flutter development. If you're doing Android, then of course you use the Android. All right, so these are the files for the project structure. Now, before I explain the project structure, I want to run this app. So make sure that you have your Android emulator set up. Okay, so if you click on this button right here, and you should have an Android emulator device. And if you haven't set up this, and you should actually go back to the previous lesson to do it. So I'm going to start my Android emulator right here by clicking the button, and then I can close this one. All right, so it's very fast. Okay, so this is a kind of a new version of the emulator provided by Android Studio. It's much faster than the past. Okay, if you ever done Android development before, you know how slow it was to start an emulator like this. But right now, it's really fast and efficient, right? So this is your emulator, everything's ready. And then once you run this one successfully, you should be able to see in the Android Studio right here. Okay, so some kind of a device has been connected. So right here is the Android SDK build for x68. So this is the one that you just run here. Now with this one, you can actually start to run your app, right? So I'm gonna actually click on this button right here, and then to trigger running. And of course, you have to build the application first. All right, so this is gonna take some time, okay? Always remember, the first time you run Android app, when you build it, every time when you reopen your Android Studio, it's going to take a long time. Okay, so this is a kind of a complicated build process, especially it builds the software for both Android and iOS. So that's why it takes a little bit longer. But then the second time from then on, it will be faster. Okay, but just don't be surprised if the first process here takes too much time. And also, as I mentioned, Android Studio, emulator, all of this takes a lot of resources and memories and CPU. So if your computer is not really most up to date, it's not uncommon. It takes a longer time. Okay, so just very, very expected if you are hitting a longer time. All right, so here we go. So we got this app up and running, and this is the Flutter Demo App and provided by the Flutter SDK. And you can see you have this label here, number here, click the button to run everything, and it will increment the number. All right, so if you have this one set up, you can do everything I showed. That means you're good to go, okay? If for some reason your emulator is not opening or your code is not showing, you cannot run it, all of those issues, Google it, fix it before you dive into the next steps. All right, so that's the very first thing you should do. All right, so I'm going to talk about the app and code a little bit later, but this lesson, I want everyone to understand the basic Flutter project structure, okay? So let's actually focus on the left-hand side here. All right, so as you can see, this is your app files for the whole project. Now, different from your Python development, different from your Java development, where you only have one file most of the time, and sometimes you create multiple files for different classes. When you open an app project, you have tons of files. Okay, so you got a lot of files here, and then if you open others, a test, library, Android, iOS, you got a lot of folder, a lot of files. Okay, so that's very expected because you are developing an app, and then a single app will have a lot of dependencies. The app needs a lot of resources, some assets, and now Flutter wants to support both Android and iOS. So they need a lot of dependency files for both platforms. And eventually, your Flutter code written in Dart will be translated into iOS and Android. So that's why you actually see a lot of this Android stuff and iOS stuff, right? So I just want you to know that the app development is a kind of a more complicated development than the regular writing some Java classes or Python classes, right? But the good thing is, even though there are so many files, the files you really need to know or you will need to use frequently are only like one or two type of files. So let me go through that. All right, so inside this folder, okay, there are a lot of things, and then in my opinion, there are only 4 different type of files you will need to touch through the whole development, and then the rest of the files you can pretty much ignore them. All right, so let's start with the first one, which is library folder. Okay, this one right here, LIB stands for library. And then if you open this folder, that's where you can see this main.dart file. If you open it, and that's what this file is. Okay, so obviously this is your source code. Okay, I told you that Flutter is written in Dart. Okay, you use the Dart to write all the Flutter app, and that's where the Dart code has been set in. And you can see, just very quickly brought this code. You got a class, you got another class, you got to extend. So if you're familiar with Java, familiar with C++, the syntax looks really similar, especially for Java. I think it's almost like 90%, 95% the same to Java. So it's nothing hard to understand. So we'll talk about this code a little bit later. But here is where your source code is. Okay, so in the whole cycle of building the Flutter app, I would say 95, 98% of our time will be spent on Dart code because everything is written in Dart, including the UI. Now, this is different from Android development because in Android, we sometimes use a XML code to specify the UI, and we use Java code for the actual app functionality. Or for iOS, and then you got a user storyboard to build your UI, and then you come back to Swift to build the code. So, but for Dart, for Flutter, it's all in Dart, same languages, and it's kind of very consistent, right? So you will come back to this folder many times. Okay, this library folder. Obviously, you can have multiple files. You can organize them into different folder. That's all supported. Okay, so library is the first thing you should know because you need to open that very often. Second file you need to use is this one here called a pub/spec YAML file. Okay, let's double click on this one. You will open it. All right. So this one here, obviously, if you read this file, it's a kind of a configuration file, right? So they use this very popular YAML format where you have very concise way to specify the property. For example, it's just like a very concise version of a JSON. It's even more concise than JSON, right? So you don't have all the brackets, everything, just name colon value, name colon value. So key value, right? Separated by colon. And then so this one, obviously you can read the file, talk about the name of the app, description, and then they also give you all this kind of explanations. But I just want to point out the most important thing you should know, or you might need to change very often. Number one is version, right? Because this one you won't touch it until you start to publish your app. Every time when you publish your app, you need to bump up your version, update your version. That's where you change it. Now this one specifies your SDK, the Flutter SDK version. This is the dependency. Okay, so this is very important. Most likely you open this file because you want to add some extra dependencies, especially during the development phase. So the dependency, just like some other frameworks or language, for example, in Python, you will need to do pip install. You need to import some kind of libraries, and then that's how you manage the dependencies. Basically, whenever you need to use other libraries, you need to bring third-party library into your development, you will need to add the dependencies. Okay, so that's where you make that changes. And then you also have a dev dependency. The difference is, this one is whatever code you want to put into the production when you release your app to public. Now, sometimes you may have some testing libraries you only want to use for testing purposes, for development purposes, then you can include it here. So that won't be included in the future release version. Okay, so that's a kind of a difference. But dependencies is one major function for this YAML file because if you ever need to add the third-party libraries, come here to add it. All right, so we'll show you examples in the near future. Other than that, there are some other things down here we'll also touch in the future that specify some of the UI stuff, especially if you're trying to add some of the images, and then you actually have to specify the path of the local images here. So we'll show you examples, right? So basically, as you can see, this configuration file, okay, this is a pub/spec.yaml file, is really a kind of a global configuration for the whole project. Dependencies, assets, version, name, everything. So that means that it's very important, but you don't really need to come here to change it very often unless you are adding a new dependency, change the version, that's it, right? So that's the second file you will need to touch, all right? Now, the third thing are these two folders. Okay, you got an Android folder, you got an iOS folder, all right? Now, I already explained briefly that the reason we have the two folders is because Flutter is a framework that supports both Android and iOS platforms. So we can run your app in Android, in iOS, just like I showed you here. I can run it in Android, right? But the Android does not support Flutter natively, does not run Dart. Android use Java, Kotlin, use Android framework, right? So in order to make your Flutter app run here on Android, so what Flutter does is they actually use a lot of techniques to translate your code and to rebuild it and actually generate an Android actual project for you so that this project can be running on Android devices or iOS devices, right? So eventually what's running here are still Android code. It's just we don't have to write the Android code directly. We're writing Dart and then it will be translated, will be built for Android, for iOS. So that's why you will always see the Android folder and also folder here, because whenever you want to run them, and you do need to have these files. So, but these two folders are managed and generated automatically. So we almost don't need to touch them, but there are some exceptions. Because sometime later on, if you are trying to add some third-party dependencies, okay, you might need to go back to some of these folders to make some changes, very minor changes, such as dependencies, such as some of the permissions, some of the special properties for the configuration files for Android. So whenever we need to do that, you will be able to find that in some of the documentation. Again, this one mainly happens when you're trying to bring some of the third-party libraries for certain special functionalities, because there might be some things you need to do extra to configure those. So that's why I just want to point it out. The Android folder is right here, iOS folder is right here, and you don't need to touch this most of the time unless some of the third-party libraries ask you to do so. All right, but that's pretty much the four things you will need to know about this folder. Even there are four things, but as I mentioned, 98% of your time are spent in this folder, library. Okay, it's all about Dart. So you want to be really good at the Dart. And that's actually the good thing about app development in Flutter. You only just know one language, you do everything here. Okay, and then very rarely you go back to here to make some changes. And even more rarely, you will need to go to this folder to make changes. And then the rest folder, you don't have to touch it, okay? This is the test folder. Unless you do some modal testing later on, you won't need it. And then this is the build folder that generates everything you will need when you run the app. But most of the time, you don't have to touch the files automatically being running. All right, so this idea folder is the folder for your IntelliJ, the Android Studio IDE, and then some kind of configuration for the Dart language. All right, so we don't really need to open those because you never need that. All right. So that's kind of a quick go through about the basic Flutter project application, the structure. So remember where to find the source code Dart. Okay.